Well, the way our current culture is, we have divested both the church and society has divested Easter of its true, actual, historical reality. We've turned it into some mystical thing. We've turned it into some emotional thing. We've turned it into a celebration of Easter bunnies. I don't see any Easter bunnies in the Gospel of John. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk about the burial, I'm going to talk about the empty tomb, I'm going to talk about the resurrection, and then I'm going to talk about how that applies to us today. But first I want to give you a brief account of something. Around 26 AD, there was a man named Sejanus. He was what we would call the chief of the secret service for the Roman Empire. He was the prefect, the head prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Now, Lucius Aelius Sejanus was a very ambitious man, and he was probably the lowest scum in the Roman Empire, if that was possible. And he knew that the Emperor Tiberius was a very paranoid and suspicious individual. So what Sejanus did was he decided that he was going to implement a conspiracy. He was going to overthrow Tiberius. He was going to kill Augustus's grandchildren, one of whom was a young man named Gaius. You all know him as Caligula. Sejanus spent years in undermining Tiberius to the point where Tiberius finally was convinced by Sejanus to go live in exile on the island of Capri, right off the coast of Naples. Well, Sejanus set about killing all of the rivals to the throne, and then finally he gets to Augustus's granddaughter Livia, and Agrippina, and before they wind up getting killed, she sends her messenger to Tiberius to tell him what Sejanus is doing. Tiberius then crafts this wonderfully worded letter to the Roman Senate, and he has his messenger stand in the Roman Senate reading this letter. And this letter starts out in praise of Sejanus, then it starts out to question Sejanus, then it starts out to lay charges against Sejanus, until finally, at the end of the letter, Sejanus is condemned by Tiberius. The Senate rises up, they arrest him. The people of Rome grab him, and in 31 AD, they drag his body through the streets and they throw him in the Tiber. In the process of him trying to establish this conspiracy, Sejanus had sent out his minions to various parts of the empire. He sent his best friend to the easternmost part of the empire. Well, after the death of Sejanus, his best friend out east got a bit concerned. Tiberius wound up spending the next few years eliminating all of the conspirators, and he finally gets to Sejanus' friend in 37 AD. And in 37 AD, Tiberius calls for Sejanus' best friend, calls him from the eastern portion of the empire. He gets on a ship, he lands at the dock in Rome, and he finds out that Tiberius had just passed away. So he got back on the ship, and he went back to Palestine, and Pontius Pilate resumed his career as governor of Palestine. Now, why do I relate that story? I relate that story for one very simple reason. Two of the three people that are mentioned in that story are very prominent in Scripture. We are dealing in Scripture, whether we talk about the Gospels or the Epistles, we are dealing with documents that are rooted and grounded in reality. These are documents that make an account of history. And one of those historical accounts that the Gospels specifically speak of is the resurrection. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about what happened when Jesus was killed. We've just experienced Good Friday. I'll touch on Holy Week in a minute. They present Jesus' body, and now they want him buried. Well, one of the historical facts that we know is a certainty, is that Joseph of Arimathea laid Jesus' body in the tomb that he owned. This becomes significant because of the people that continually question the legitimacy and the veracity of the Gospels. Now, when you read the account of Joseph placing Christ in the tomb, what jumps out at you isn't so much the big story, it's the little tiny details. The fact that the tomb was new, the fact that it belonged to a rich Pharisee. Now, any historian will tell you that, the devil's in the details. But the fact that the Gospels include such minute details demonstrate that Joseph actually owned this tomb. This is a real physical place. And those small little details demonstrate that this is significant because Joseph couldn't have placed a criminal, Jesus, in a tomb that had his relatives because they would have been defiled according to Jewish law. So the newness of the tomb plays a critical role in our appreciating the fact that this is a real, actual place. Then the Gospels tell us that, okay, Jesus was buried in Joseph's tomb, and now the women come and they want to observe, I got ahead of myself. The women actually were present at the burial. Now, why is that significant? Well, unless you are not familiar with ancient Near Eastern custom, women didn't have a very high place in ancient Near Eastern culture. I mean, unfortunately, that's just the way it is. But, and we'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute, but here we have these women who are not only reported as seeing the burial, but they witnessed the crucifixion and then they witnessed the empty tomb. So what you wind up having is you have these same groups of people mentioned in multiple different places. So you have one story attesting to the veracity of another story and attests to the veracity of a third story. So you've got cross-confirming people in different settings. Very powerful historical argument. So after they're present at the burial, we see that they went to go and present their sorrow. They were going to adorn the tomb of Christ. Well, what's the big deal? Well, during the time of Jesus, there was an extraordinary emphasis placed on the graves of Jewish martyrs and holy men. And these were very scrupulously and meticulously cared for. So, when Jesus, their teacher, died, the women, recognizing that he was this holy man, they wanted to go and pay him the same honor that all other Jewish holy men and martyrs would have been paid. Their grief at the death of their Savior fogged their vision, so they're running to a tomb. They didn't happen to ask themselves, well, how are we going to roll the stone back? How are we going to get past the Roman guards? How are we going to get past the temple police? But that demonstrates the authenticity of the story, because if we were fabricating something, all of these problems would have been rectified. They run to the tomb. They had no idea what a resurrection was, because in ancient Israel, resurrections were general. It was the whole nation. We see that in Ezekiel, the Valley of the Dry Bones. It was the whole country that was going to be resurrected, not individual people. And we saw that in the Creed this morning. The fact that holy men were so revered is seen throughout Scripture. Remember Joseph at the end of Genesis? Joseph tells his family, when I die, and what does he say? Take my bones with you. So holy men were revered because Jews thought that the whole body was going to be resurrected. They didn't have this concept that we have today, this modern idea that the body stays in the grave and Jesus' spirit was raised. That's modern. The Jews thought when one goes, everybody goes. So it would be a contradiction in their thinking to say that someone was raised from the dead but still in the tomb. So when the early Christian creed says that Jesus was buried and raised on the third day, it's saying implicitly that the tomb was empty. And here's one of the most significant elements of the burial of Christ. There's no other burial tradition that exists. Think about this. If you had a group of people today that had a message that was so powerful and it was so revolutionary that it was going to overthrow your religion, it was going to overthrow your government, it was going to overthrow your economy, and you were opposed to it, you would find every way that you possibly could to repudiate it. Why don't we see an alternative burial tradition for Jesus? We see people denying it, but we don't see we don't see a quote-unquote true account of what was going on. So the fact that there's no alternative story by people that had every reason to create an alternative story, if not present the truth, demonstrates, again, the legitimacy of the gospel accounts of the burial. So, Jesus is buried. We know for a fact that Christ existed because there's more historical evidence to prove the existence of Jesus than there is to prove that Napoleon ever fought at Waterloo or that George Washington ever existed. So we know that. We know that he was buried. We know that he was buried in a tomb by his friend. We know that the women went to honor him as a holy man, and we know that this is a legitimate representation of what was going on because there's no other story. Well, now they get to the tomb, and the women show up, and what's happening? Nobody's around. The Romans are gone. The Jewish guard is gone. The stones moved. And Jesus is gone. The tomb is now empty. Now, I mentioned the status of women earlier, and this is always problematic, so I'm not saying that you guys don't have a powerful place in our world today. But back then, not so much. According to Jewish law, one of the rabbinical statements was, let the words of the law be burned rather than delivered to a woman. And blessed is the man whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female. Now, I mention that for this reason. I don't mention that to slam you guys. I mention that because this demonstrates, again, the power and the authenticity of the historical record of what we read in the Gospels. Why? Well, if you're creating a movement that's going to overthrow the Roman Empire, that's going to countermand the Jewish religion, that's going to destroy the economic system of these people because you can't charge for worshiping pagan deities anymore because all these people are going to go worship this one guy, Jesus. And you're creating this story. Why are you going to use the lowest members of your culture to act as witnesses for the greatest story you want the world to hear? So the testimony of the women today becomes one of the strongest arguments for the empty tomb. Why would Christianity, why would later Christian leaders humiliate the apostles? Why would they create this story where Peter, James, and John are off hiding somewhere, which they were, because they all were hiding somewhere? All of our big, brave, strong men, our tough fishermen, are cowering in a room, and these women discover the empty tomb. You would think if we were fabricating a story and we were creating something to convince people, we would say, no, 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 no. It was Peter, the brave fisherman, who stood for Jesus at every turn. He was the first one there. He waded through the Roman guards. He challenged the Jewish police, and he discovered the tomb. That ain't how it happened. So like it or not, the early Christians had to deal with the fact that women discovered the empty tomb. And this is probably the most powerful argument that you're going to find. It would have been impossible for the disciples to proclaim the resurrection in Jerusalem if the tomb wasn't really empty. Think about it. Peter's running around Jerusalem, the very city in which Jesus was crucified as a criminal. And now he's running around and he's saying, the tomb's empty. He rose from the dead. And he runs to the Romans. The tomb is empty. He rose from the dead. And he goes to the Jews. The tomb's empty, and he rose from the dead. Well, what's the problem? If the tomb wasn't empty and he didn't rise from the dead, the Romans and the Jews would have went, Peter, psst, come here, let me show you something. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? But they didn't. The first thing that we see is they tried to make up stories to repudiate the disciples' account. Even the Jews, in the earliest arguments against Christianity, what did they do? Did they say, Hiram, we've got the body. Come see the body. He's right here. Look, I buried him. No, they made up lies. Tell them that the guards fell asleep. Nobody was awake. And then the disciples came in and stole the body. Okay, first question. If the guards are asleep, how'd they know the disciples stole the body? That's pretty impressive. Second question. Anybody know Roman law? Anybody know the punishment for falling asleep on guard duty in Rome? It isn't a reprimand. The Roman tribune, ahead of the unit, would line all of the contingent up. He would line the guards up. And in front of the tomb, there were approximately 24 Roman soldiers. And he would line them up in one row, and he would start at the far end, and he would take out his dagger, and he would go 1, 2, 3, you're dead. 1, 2, you're dead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he would randomly kill however many he determined needed to die. So the Jews tried to convince the Romans to tell the world that they fell asleep at the penalty of death. But they never said, here's the body. And something that screams to be treated with respect is something that's ignored by everybody. We've already seen that at this time in history it was a prominent event to venerate the tombs of holy men and martyrs. Can anybody tell me here where the tomb of Jesus is? I mean, we have, we guess. Is it the Garden Tomb? Is it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? We don't know. We really don't know. You know why we don't know? Because he wasn't there to be venerated. The tomb was empty. If Jesus had been in the grave, what the women set out to do that Easter morning would have been a tradition that would have carried on forever, because they would have known where he was. Well, the reality is they did know where he was. It just wasn't there. So, historically, we have great arguments for the burial, for the empty tomb, and now I'm going to give you the four most prominent arguments against the resurrection. These are the most common ones. It doesn't matter how many you hear. Ultimately, it will boil down to these four arguments. But I'm going to give you just a thumbnail refutation. Number one, the conspiracy theory, and we've already seen it. Go tell somebody something that the disciples stole a body. This was the first attempt at refuting the actual resurrection. All right. There are a number of different arguments that can be used to refute this. I'm going to quote from the earliest refutation, Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian, in the 300s. This was what he wrote. And if you don't think that people in the early church had a sense of humor, listen to the words that Eusebius wrote. Eusebius said, this is the rationale behind the conspiracy theory. This is what the disciples had to think when they came up with this alleged conspiracy theory to steal the body of Jesus. Eusebius says, okay, the disciples got together and they said, let us band together. Let's invent all these miracles and a resurrection appearances, which we never saw, and let us carry the shame even to death. I mean, why not die for nothing? I mean, why dislike torture and whipping? I mean, who cares that they're inflicted for no good? Let's go out to all the nations, overthrow their institutions, denounce their gods. And even if we don't convince anybody, at least we'll have the satisfaction of drawing down on ourselves the punishment of our own deceit. Now, you've got to appreciate the sarcasm there. But that's the point. If the disciples had stolen the body, you have to account for two things. Number one, they preached their entire lives moral perfection. They preached the perfection and the holiness of Christ. They preached against lying. And now these people want us to believe that these people who stood their entire lives for moral honesty and uprightness based it upon a lie. And then the second thing is, I know people that will die for a lie. We see it all the day. We see it every day. How many planes were flown into the World Trade Center? People die for a lie. I don't know of anybody who will allow themselves to be tortured for a lie, fully knowing that it's a lie. And every one of the apostles died a martyr's death. So you mean to tell me that you want me to believe that these 12 men who weren't warriors, they weren't military geniuses, they weren't heroes, they were common individuals. Each and every one of these men said, I'm going to create this lie, I'm going to suffer the indignation of this lie, I'm going to identify myself with a criminal, I'm going to suffer the reproach of society, all for a lie, and then I'm going to let you kill me. For a lie. Now, I don't know about you, but my cuticles tear, and when I tear that cuticle, I cry like a baby. I can't imagine being tortured for a lie. That's what they want us to believe. The second and the third ones are so funny that they're almost not worth refuting. But the second one is the swoon theory. And I'm sure you may have heard this somewhere along the line, because this theory, the swoon theory, not the conspiracy theory, which, okay, I think it's wrong, but at least, you got some merit to it. It makes sense to say that they stole the body until you analyze the details. The swoon theory is so bad that even liberals rejected it in the 1800s. When they were rejecting the Bible, they were rejecting God, they were rejecting everything. But they said, this is even a bit too much for us. And yet, it keeps showing up. First time we saw a really powerful attempt at presenting this in modern times was in the 60s with Hugh Schoenfeld, called The Passover Plot. Anybody remember that? That was a very popular book, but neither here nor there. The problems with the swoon theory are threefold. Number one, it fails to take seriously the extent of Jesus' physical injury. Number two, it makes Jesus appear to be into a deceiver, the necessary implication that Jesus was a charlatan who tricked the disciples into believing that he had been raised from the dead. And the last one is that a half weak and dead Jesus could never have convinced the disciples that he was Lord of life and the conqueror of death. What I want to do is I want to recount just a couple of the reasons why they didn't take the extent of Jesus' physical injuries seriously enough. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through this. Jesus was arrested on Thursday night. He was illegally tried. He was sent to a Jewish court. During the trial, they spit on him. They blindfolded him. They punched him in the face with their fists. They then turned him over to the guards, who then beat him. He went all night without sleep. Pontius Pilate received him, interrogated him, sent him back to Herod, who interrogated him, sent him back to Pilate. He was condemned before a crowd screaming for his blood. He was given to the Roman guards, who scourged him, and they whipped him to within an inch of his life. They then made a crown of thorns, which were between 1 and 6 inches long. They jammed it on his head, and then they beat him with a stick. He was then made to carry his own cross, on which he was incapable, and he fell 3 times, until ultimately Simon of Cyrene was told to carry it. He was then laid on the cross. His arms were extended, and the nails were driven through his wrists and his ankles. And now, judging from the skeletal remains of crucifixion victims, they probably turned him sideways. Now, whether or not you even accept that the Shroud of Turin is or is not Christ is irrelevant, because regardless of what that is, it gives us incredible forensic evidence as to what a crucifixion looked like. When those nails drove through his wrists, now you got to imagine this. Everybody remember the Passion of Christ? Everybody see the Passion? The Passion of the Christ? Okay, well, if you ever want to see what a crucifixion looks like, for all of his faults, Mel Gibson did a magnificent job researching that historically. He looked like hamburger. I mean, that's the most polite way of saying it. Because the Romans had no limit. 90% of all crucifixion victims never made it to the cross during a Roman scourging. They killed them. And if you remember in the movie, Pilate said, scourge him, but don't kill him. Specifically gave them the command, don't kill him. Now, that's extra biblical, but that makes sense because that's usually what happened. His back was literally flayed open. So they put this wooden beam on his back. They elevated him and they dropped him into a hole which would have dislocated his shoulders and his hips. The nail going through his wrists would have hit the median nerve running up his neck, down his spine, causing his body to stiffen and forcing him to elevate himself on his legs. The minute he elevated himself on his legs, the nerves in his ankles would have forced his body to jam itself down because of the pain. And this would have continued and continued and continued and continued until he died. But mind you, the swoon theory tells us that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He was placed in a tomb, a dank, musty tomb. He was wrapped in over 100 pounds of linen and spices and ointments, which was traditional for a Jewish burial. He was sealed in that tomb with a 3-ton stone. He was guarded by over 24 men. And then on the 3rd day, to steal from Josh McDowell, which I still think is one of the best depictions I've ever seen, here comes Jesus wrapped in all of these clothes, completely covered in these garments, hopping out. He kicks the tomb over, sheds off all of these clothes, and he looks at his disciples with the beard in his face ripped out, his eyes swollen shut, blood soaking his face, his arms and his back completely torn up, and he says, "I am the conqueror of death." Now, if they retained their lunch and didn't vomit by seeing him, and if they didn't run in abject fear based upon seeing this human piece of filet mignon standing before them, I have a very hard time believing that he would have been able to convince them that he was the Lord of life. To the degree that even D.F. Strauss, who is probably the arch enemy of Christianity in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. He was a liberal. He rejected everything. He rejected the resurrection. He rejected everything. Said of this theory, it is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at last yielded to his sufferings, could have given to his disciples the impression that he was the conqueror over death and the grave and the prince of life, an impression which lay at the bottom, at the heart of their future ministry. Such a resuscitation could have only weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and in death, and at the most could have only given it an elegiac voice, a cry, but could not possibly have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm or elevated their reverence to worship. Now you combine this with the contemporary understanding of an actual Roman crucifixion, and the swoon theory is impossible. The stupidest one I've ever heard is the wrong tomb theory. Kearsarge Lake, who was a brilliant New Testament scholar, liberal, unfortunately, but brilliant scholar, again, rejected the resurrection. His argument was, well, you're dealing with Jewish women. They were stupid. They went to the wrong tomb. What can you expect? Now, the refutations of this become so easy, it's almost laughable. Okay, the women went to the wrong tomb because they were in grief. Fine, I'll grant they were in grief. They couldn't have turned around and said, wait a minute, that tree's not supposed to be there. It's supposed to be over there. Oh, I'm at the wrong tomb. No, they couldn't do that. And they couldn't turn around and say, Joseph, where's your tomb? I mean, the guy who owned the tomb most likely wouldn't have gone to the wrong tomb. But they will have us believe, because they can believe anything but the resurrection, they'll have us believe that these women went to the wrong tomb, the disciples went to the wrong tomb, Joseph, who owned the tomb, went to the wrong tomb, and the Romans and the Jews decided they still didn't need to produce the body. Stupidest theory I've ever heard in my life. One of the most powerful theories, the one that gains the most traction in society, especially in our contemporary culture, is the hallucination theory. Now, I have to define a couple of terms because we get these confused. We confuse illusion, delusion, and hallucination. An illusion is a distorted perception. Remember when we were in science class and we used to take a stick and stick it in water and the stick would bend? Now, did the stick actually bend? Well, no, of course not. But our perception of the stick, we saw the stick bend. That's an illusion. A delusion is a false belief. So a delusion is a belief such like Donald Trump's going to be elected president. Or that Barack Obama's doing a really great job. See, that's a delusion. I'm sorry, I just had to throw it out, at least a cup. I got a Republican and a Democrat. I hit both sides. A hallucination, however, is a false perception, which means it could be based on something real, but your perception of it is incorrect. Well, number one, we know that hallucinations are private occurrences. They don't happen in the mind of mass groups. We see this every day, and nobody takes account of it. As a former Marine, somebody who was in the Army, and a Marine, we know that we have guys that go through some of the most rigorous, insane military training in the world. Our special ops guys, recon, SEALs, Green Berets, Rangers, Air Force special ops people. The stuff that they put these people through is designed to create an environment that is conducive to hallucination, sleep deprivation. Essentially what it is it's legalized torture. That's what they put these people through. And yet, when the psychologists interview all of these guys after their training, or right after a specific evolution in their training, the hallucinations aren't uniform. They took a boat crew of Navy SEALs one night, and they had them out on the water after 40 hours of being awake. One guy swore he was talking to an octopus who was telling him how to get back to shore. Another guy actually stood up in the Zodiac, in the boat. And the guy said, "Where you going?" He goes, "Oh, my yacht's here, I'm leaving," and started to jump out to get into the yacht. They interviewed some Army Rangers after they were 3 weeks into Ranger School, and the Rangers are saying that the whole course of Ranger School is 60 days, and you average 2 hours of sleep a night. They're out on a patrol one night, a long-range patrol, and one of the cadre is looking at this ranger, and he's doing this by a tree. And the guy's going, "What are you doing?" And he's going, "I want a Coke." He's putting quarters into a tree. Hallucinations occur individually. They do not occur in mass quantities of groups of people. We could all be here and see the same thing. We could all be here and have a hallucination. We could be in a state that manifests hallucinations, and we all wouldn't see the same thing. Even if all of 12 of them did have hallucinations, what's the one problem with the hallucination theory? Empty tomb. They still could have got the body. Hallucinations don't account for the conversion of the Apostle Paul. He wasn't in a state of despair. He wasn't in a state of grief. He wasn't in an emotionally distraught. He was thrilled. He was killing Christians and loving it. He was going around. He was at the execution of Stephen. He threw his coat down, indicating, "Yes, I'm giving you authority to stone this young man." He loved it. How do you account for his conversion? How do you account for his seeing Christ on the road to Damascus? How do you account for James, Jesus' brother, who told Jesus, "You're a false prophet"? He rejected Christ's ministry his entire life. He didn't seem to care one way or another that the Messiah had died. But yet, James changed his entire religious orientation because of his confrontation with his risen brother. And then you've got the account in 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, first Jesus appeared to the women. Then he appeared to Peter, James, and John. Then he appeared to the rest of the disciples. Then he appeared to me as one born out of time. Then he appeared to 500 people. And the kicker in that statement by the Apostle Paul is, many of whom are still alive today. You're going to tell me that this over 600 people had the same identical hallucination and nobody went and questioned them? There's just too many variances. And that's the problem with the hallucination hypothesis. Because it's impossible for Jesus' disciples to have believed he was raised from the dead if the bones and the body of the corpse were still in the tomb before them. The resurrection accounts in the Bible record the actual, physical, historical rising of Jesus from the dead. It actually happened. That's why I pointed out the story of Sejanus and Tiberius and Pilate. These men existed in history, and the gospel account includes their names with the exception of Sejanus. This is not a spiritual, spooky, ghost-type resurrection. This is not mythical. It's not an Aesop's fable story where we all get warm and fuzzy about a man who, in spirit, went to be with God, but in reality, he's still kind of in the ground somewhere. This is a real flesh and blood body, and he was risen from the dead to provide the answer to man's greatest single problem, his alienation from his holy, sovereign creator because of sin. Now, what does it mean for us? Well, with the joy of forgiveness, hope, and resurrection and blessing, there's also something that has to be pointed out, and that is that joy, forgiveness, hope, resurrection, and blessing is for Christ's people. Because Christ's people have that joy of forgiveness and hope and resurrection and blessing. If people are outside of the church, if they are outside of a relationship with Christ, if they don't recognize the resurrection and its import, that's a warning. This is a real event. This is an event that not only changed the past, it changes the present, and it changes the future. All of human history focuses on the resurrection and the life of Christ. Even if you study liberal material, liberal history, liberal anthropology, liberal archaeology, and you read these texts where they changed it from BC AD to BC to BCE to CE, before the Common Era to the Common Era. Well, what's the difference? What's before the Common Era and what's the Common Era? Christ. Now consider this. Consider this. This event in its totality should make us soberly and responsibly and seriously consider the claims that God makes on every single one of us. And he makes it through his word, and he makes it through his son, and he makes it via his law. Now consider that we don't see the law. Everybody ever seen the law? The law? What's the law? Anybody ever see it? I've never seen it. I have a concept, but it's not something tangible. Yet we're responsible to obey the law. 65 miles an hour. I've never seen the law, but that's what I'm told, and I'm responsible to obey it. We can't touch it, we can't smell it, we can't taste it, but it's real, and we're held accountable when we violate that law. Do we think that the demands of God are any less real simply because we can't touch them, or taste them, or smell them? If you think that, remember, the resurrection is a real historical physical event. And God, via his risen Son, makes real demands on us through the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus is the most blessed event in the history of mankind. It provides peace from the judgment of God. Everybody asks, are you saved? Are you saved? Are you saved? Are you saved from what? What are you saved from? It's not Satan, and it's not sin. The reason the cross is so important is because Christ saves us from God's judgment of sin. It provides an answer to the most vexing questions of our existence. Any question. Some will be answered now, some will be answered later, but the answer is in the cross. It gives us purity of life and hope for future blessings. Because if Jesus physically rose from the dead as the first fruits, then we'll rise from the dead in him. The only question to be asked is this: when you rise from the dead, and it'll happen, will you rise covered by the Lamb's blood, clothed in that perfectly pure garment of Christ's righteousness, which is given to us? Or will you rise in your own strength and authority, claiming your own righteousness on which to stand before God? At the advent of Jesus' ministry, Israel knew sin couldn't be defeated. Their entire history demonstrated, it screamed that sin couldn't be defeated. Their situation looked bleak, and all Israel could do was still hope in the covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham. But where would the restoration come from? It would come from the place that it had always come. It came from a lamb, but not the kind of lamb that they were used to. You see, this lamb would be a divine lamb. This lamb would be a perfect lamb, and he would also be a human lamb. A payment, a ransom, a reparation for sin in which Christ paid to God, not Satan. Satan is not an equal deity with God. That was paid to God. And however, this lamb, as the lambs in the Old Covenant, is for God's people only. That is why it's so critical that's why it was so critical for Israel to witness to the nations and bring them into the covenant. That's why it is so critical for us to witness to the nations and bring them in to the church. Because that covering is for them. It's for Christ's people. However, now we find God's people not limited ethnically, not by a nation, but coming from all the nations. This lamb is the lamb for the new covenant, Israel, the church. But as in the old covenant, simply calling yourself something doesn't make it so. You can call yourself a Jew, that didn't make you a Jew. You had to apply the blood to your life. You had to put it on the doorpost and the lintels. And simply being a Jew wasn't enough. And just coming to church doesn't make you a Christian. I don't know how many people have that mistake. If they show up, they do some things, especially in our tradition. We get people that get so comfortable in doing things over and over and over again that they think, oh, that means I'm fine. No, sorry, that ain't the case. You must be identified with Christ, and you must, by faith, apply his blood as the ancient Jew applied his blood. This lamb now is our substitute and our payment. He's also our scapegoat. Remember, when the individual brought his sacrifice to the priest would have him place his hands on the scapegoat. And in the Hebrew, the word gives the impression of transition, where there is a transference of that individual to the goat. One was killed and the other one was set outside the camp. The scapegoat was sent away from the nation of Israel. Sin was removed from the camp. The only problem is Christ came into the holy city, the blessed city of peace, and was rejected and crucified outside the holy city. He was made the scapegoat. The Holy One of God was rejected by the holy city of God, making that holy city no longer holy. It is now unclean. We look at the crucifixion and we think, my gosh, this is just incredible. And the sad part is, it was done by his own people, those he came to save. And during the entire traumatic event of Christ's scourging and crucifixion, he didn't say a word. While he was being beaten, he never asked why. While he was being whipped, he never said, I'm innocent. And while he was being taunted and spat upon, he never asked, why are you attacking me? And here's something to consider. Every time we sin, it is we who beat him, and it is we who taunt him, it is we who rejected him, it is we who spat upon him. We were the crowd, and we were the mob, and we were the Jews, and we were the Romans, and we held that flagrum that whipped him. And during this entire merciless carnival of cruelty, Jesus was wrongfully accused, wrongfully scourged, treated injuriously, and never said a word. And when you're wrongfully treated, or you're wrongfully accused, how do you act? Or what do? Do you follow this example? He came into this world, he was born under the law, he identified with his people, the nation of Israel. He came to restore in the church purity and salvation. He bore sin, he was tortured, and he was obedient to his Father. Oh, and I forgot to mention one thing. He was sinless. Anyone care to raise their hand and make that claim? We can never claim that we are sinless, innocent blood. Now, some of you have heard me give this illustration, and I'm about to close. Some of you have heard me give this illustration before, but I'm going to recount this story anyway. My eldest son served in Iraq in 2004, 2005. And during the build-up to the very first Iraqi election in Mosul on January 28, 2005, my 20-year-old son, who was 4 days shy of his 21st birthday and 10 days away from rotating home, received a fatal gunshot wound to his head, and he was killed. Now, I say that not to elicit your sympathy, because I know that's your normal reaction. The reason I'm saying that is this. Because as humans, sometimes we understand spiritual things better when they're placed in a human context. And I'm telling you this because no matter how bad my pain is, and no matter how much I long to see him, and no matter how much I miss holding him, my pain is nothing compared to the pain the Father experienced in losing his son on that day. I had Stephen for only 20 years. The Father and the Spirit had the Son for all eternity. Now, Stephen and I experienced periods of separation. The Father and the Spirit never separated from the Son. And Stephen and I had the types of disagreements and fights that fathers and sons have, and the Father and the Spirit were never in disagreement. And then on what we refer to as Good Friday 2,000 years ago, after the triumphal entry, where the King was proclaimed on Palm Sunday, he saw the abuse of his house in the temple and he cleansed it on Wednesday, sat down and had a fellowship meal with his friends on Thursday, and Friday that fellowship with the Father and the Spirit changed for the first time in all eternity, because the triune Godhead was in some sense separated from one another, because at that moment all of our sin and all of the past sin of the world and all of the future sin to be committed, God poured out on his perfect, holy, innocent Son for 6 straight hours. We always forget that there is a time involved here. This is a real act. God's judgment is real, and it was poured out on the only perfect being that could sustain his judgment. And because of that sin, because of our sin, the Father and the Spirit, for the first time in all of eternity, physically turned their back for a second on the Son. So when you think about the crucifixion, I want you to think about 2 things. Number 1, for all intents and purposes, we drove those nails into Christ's hands and feet, and we jammed that crown of thorns on his head, and we thrust that spear in his side because we crucified him because of our sin. And even more importantly, if that's possible, we should have been on that cross instead of him. The resurrection today, Easter, the resurrection is a moment of decision. It is a moment of separation. Today, all things in history are evaluated by today. Before this day, there was death in sin. After this day, there was life in Christ. Before this day, we were all enemies of God. After this day, those in Christ are his friends. Before this day, we were condemned because of sin. After this day, in Christ we are pardoned. Before this day, we had no hope. Good Friday is the day where the world saw its hope end. But today, we have the guarantee of hope. Before this day, we were unrighteous, and today we are righteous. And before this day, we were aliens and strangers to God and to Christ and to his blessings. And today we are his children. Before this day, we were Christless. Today, we are Christ's. The resurrection is the inauguration, and I'm going to close with this. It is the announcement that the king has assumed his throne, and all who are identified with that king will share in his great feast, the marriage supper of the Lamb, of which communion is just a small taste, an anticipation of something even more wonderful to come. And that is why the church historically considers each and every Sunday a mini Easter. This is no myth. This is no fantasy. This is a physical fact, and it will happen. On this most holiest of days of the church year, we all need to examine ourselves. Examine yourselves. Are you submissive to Christ? Will you bow your knee before him? Will you accept that it is only based on his righteousness given to us by faith alone, whereby we can enter his kingdom? Before his authority, before those whom he has placed in authority over you, or will you stand in your own righteousness? This is the day to resolve that question, right here, where his salvation is communicated to you in this communion. Every woman, every man, and every child ultimately will have to answer for the cross. Everybody will. And on which side of the resurrection then will you be standing? Make your decision for the Lamb of God, or face the Lion of Judah. There's no third option. Now is the time, and now is the day of salvation.